Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, or should I say, welcome to Rubicon, because today we'll be reviewing Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon. For anybody not acquainted with the Armored Core series, the first Armored Core game was a PS1 game released in 1997, and it was the first big hit for a little-known studio called From Software. Armored Core got quite a few sequels and expansions leading up to Armored Core 5. Piggybacking on the success of Elden Ring, From Software is now going back to their roots after a 10-year-long hiatus from the Armored Core franchise, and we're here to look at whether or not Armored Core 6 lives up to both the previous installments in the series and the much expanded catalog of From Software games. The Armored Core series has always been about extensive mech customization, both functional and cosmetic, along with general gameplay flow of going out on missions to earn more money for more parts to go out on harder missions. The mechs in Armored Core behave more like Gundams, i.e. a giant guy wearing armor, rather than something like, say, Battletech, where they're a lot more lumbering and sluggish machines. The series has been defined by both limited health and ammo, meaning your resources to meet a challenge are finite. In Armored Core 6, you do get 3 repair packs, but this still puts your health as a finite resource that you still have to manage. And your health doesn't dramatically increase throughout the game because your health is more based on your build type rather than how far you've progressed. And this does give the game a fairly different feel from something like, say, Dark Souls, where most of your weapons are melee focused, so you obviously have effectively unlimited ammo to attempt a boss. The original Armored Core opened with an animation of choosing various mech parts before showing those mechs engaged in fast-paced combat, which kinda did a good job of setting the overall tone for the game. Armored Core 6 leads off assuming players are generally familiar enough with the basic premise, so instead it goes the route of general world building and exposition, which is entirely fair. However, this is a From Software game, so expect the world building to be painfully vague. From Software have always been the master of wiki games, that is, games where if you want the full lore, you'll be spending hours combing through wiki pages or watching YouTube videos. From Software was doing wiki games before wiki games even existed, which in retrospect may explain why games like Elden Ring have fared much better than some of their previous offerings. The plot opens with you being an unnamed augmented mercenary with a fried brain going to the planet Rubicon, which was desolated by a cataclysm about 50 years ago. You're looking for Coral, which is essentially unobtainium. For most of the game's runtime, Coral is very poorly explained or expanded on as anything other than simply a commodity that your character can sell, which does lead to some real motivation problems. At around the halfway mark, I had enough credits in the bank and enough mech parts to sell to comfortably retire on a planet of my choosing. It increasingly seemed like my character was only hanging around because nobody told them they could leave and they had a job they were good at. And I have to say, if that's the case, I have never sympathized more with a character's motivation in a game in my entire life. Now, the opening mission for Armored Core 1 just plops you in an arena and says you get to leave and start playing the actual game when you successfully kill anything. The video game equivalent of opening a conversation by throwing a brick at someone's face, and if they can't dodge it, you didn't want to talk to them anyways. It didn't have a full tutorial explaining the controls, but this is also back when games had manuals, and a lot of this information would have been listed in the manual, so they kind of just seemed to assume that you had read it. Armored Core 6 has a much softer opening, going over at least a lot of the basic controls, although I do feel like this is more From Software begrudgingly admitting that manuals aren't a thing, rather than them having a kinder and gentler mindset. Now, you move using the left analog stick and look using the right one. This is called an affordance. Most gamers are used to this control scheme given how often it appears, so your average player will find it pretty natural and doesn't even necessarily need it explained. You also have a jump button, and holding that jump button allows you to fly. However, both the initial jump and trying to keep yourself in the air will consume energy. You do also have access to quick boosts. The quick boosts function a lot like dodges from the Souls family of games. You rapidly dart in one direction by pressing the boost button and moving the analog stick in the direction which you want to boost. Overall, pretty straightforward. Each boost will consume some of your energy. And if you're still holding the analog stick in a direction when you complete your boost, you'll actually launch into a bit of a glide boost where you'll be gliding along the round. This doesn't actually consume energy, and it's also significantly faster than walking. The only time I ever really use walking in the game, because it's so slow that if you're using it in combat you're basically just a giant target, is in some of the stealth and platforming sections, and those sections are kind of dodgy anyway. The last form of movement you have is the Assault Boost. The Assault Boost is essentially just straight up flight. Your character rockets to the air. Now, while you're Assault Boosting, your control over your movement is fairly limited. You can dodge to an extent, you can still fire your weapons, but you won't have the type of fine controls that you'll have in all other movement modes. Now, one thing to note about energy is that your energy will regenerate very quickly once your feet actually touch the ground and you're no longer currently boosting, although glide boosting doesn't affect this. So you could say it's kind of more forgiving than the Dark Souls stamina system. However, the game kind of knows that you'll have your boost available a lot more often, so a lot of the challenges are balanced around it, so it ends up evening out in the long term. Now, the base combat uses a lock-on system that veterans of the series will be somewhat familiar with. All you really have to do is put your crosshair in the general direction of an enemy and lock on whoever is closest to it, and you'll see a little red lock appear telling you that your weapons are ready to fire on this person. Now, it's important to note this doesn't mean your weapons will hit, it just means your weapons are locked onto them. They can still potentially dodge, they can still potentially break line of sight, because pretty much all of the ranged attacks in this game are essentially projectiles, and because they're projectiles, if something gets in the way, they can still hit it. You also have missiles. Now, missiles are going to be represented by little yellow bars that will slowly fill up. Missiles do take longer to lock than normal ranged weapons, and additionally, the more missiles you are trying to lock, the longer it will take the missiles to lock. You can also do what's called a multi-target, which is you hold down the missile button, so instead of targeting one person, you're going to target everybody that is considered a valid target. And once you release it, once all of them are full and once you release it, the missiles will fly at their target separately. Generally speaking, when you do a multi-lock, the system will try to distribute the missiles as evenly as possible among as many targets as possible, so it's only really useful for engaging incredibly lightly armored targets. It's not really going to do anything against much heavier opponents. The final form of attack is melee attacks. Melee attacks are generally quite powerful, but they also lock you into very specific animations and have much shorter ranges. However, melee attacks do have the redeeming feature of having unlimited ammo, so as long as you have a melee attack, you always have ammo. Additionally, once you've expended all your weapons, the weapons will kind of drop off of your mech as you expend them, so you will ultimately just come down to your bare fists if you run out of everything, but you probably don't want to be doing that. Now, the way you actually attack with the weapons once you have the lock is very simple. Your left hand weapon is controlled by the left trigger, your right hand weapon is controlled by the right trigger, your left shoulder weapon is controlled by the left bumper, your right shoulder weapon is controlled by the right bumper. This is overall a very simple control schema for controlling your weapons, and the controls broadly in this game are very simple and intuitive because From Software doesn't like the challenge being mastering or memorizing 100 different button combinations. It likes putting the meat and the challenge of the game into making sure you're pressing the right buttons at the right time and in the right order. It's not necessarily worried about trying to do these like three-handed button presses, which makes the gameplay in From Software games more about thoughtfulness than about necessarily having like twitch reflexes or like rote memorization. The most inconsistent part of combat for me, hands down, was the melee system, because your character will lunge forward, and if you're in the air, you will stop, lose all of your own momentum, and then immediately lunge forward. And the exact hitbox of the weapon combined with its awkward animation often made for a lot of melee weapons being kind of dodgy and inconsistent. You would have instances where you'd get hits and you didn't think you did, or where you didn't get a hit and you thought you would. But overall, I think the system as a whole really works, and it's very intuitive. So as the game is introducing you to these basic controls, the game lets you wander around the city, jet boosting around, taking out some chumps, and trying to find a valid license, because apparently you're here illegally, although the game never really explains exactly what illegally means in this context. And then it proceeds to start throwing a brick at your face in the form of a gunship battle. The gunship is basically your first boss battle in the game. It's baby's first boss, and if you expected a nice, relaxing, big robot customization game, the gunship is probably gonna be your quit moment. While the game does let you get some basic facility with the movement and shooting controls before you go into the gunship battle, it's still going to be a pretty tough fight for a lot of new players, because the trick to the gunship battle really is using the impact system. Now, every time you hit somebody with an attack, or they hit you with an attack, you're going to see either their yellow bar fill up over their head, or your yellow bar fill up over your energy bar. Once this yellow bar is full, the character will be staggered for a certain number of seconds, and then also the bar will be flashing red. While the bar is flashing red, the person takes quote-unquote direct hit damage, which is additional damage on top of the normal damage a weapon would deal. And the key to the gunship battle is staggering the gunship, because it has a very long stagger, unlike a lot of other bosses you'll encounter later. And also doing the extra damage from that stagger will make it go down a lot faster while it's not attacking you. and you really need to be aggressive and use your assault boost to get the melee attacks in and land these staggers, because you can't really do this by peppering it with ranged attacks alone. This is also a good time to bring up the notable difference between the Souls family and Armored Core. Dark Souls is often called tough but fair. This isn't entirely accurate, but sums up the general design where the world follows a set of rules that doesn't break, and both you and the enemy abides by them. Armored Core is tough and unfair. The gunship battle briefly hints at this, because despite the fact that you literally just flew into this boss arena, the game doesn't let you fly out, but it does let the gunship fly out. This won't be the last time we see examples of the world behaving inconsistently based on how the designers want the encounter to flow. Armored Core isn't made to necessarily be fair, but it isn't made to be unfair either, if that makes sense. Not every mission is designed to be beaten with every build. The game assumes that you will be as unfair to it as possible, and it will be as unfair to you as possible, and that's why it doesn't punish you for trying and failing. And we'll explore that entire concept later as we go throughout this review. Now, after beating the gunship, you'll lose a license off a corpse, and the call sign will be Raven. There is some incongruity here, because we meet a Raven later, and those guys are absolute murder machines, so what the hell killed this one is beyond me, but I guess Legacy games got a legacy, because the Ravens do date back all the way to Armored Core 1. After you complete your first mission, you'll get access to the mech customization, and this is the heart and soul of the Armored Core experience, and there is a lot going on here. So you get into the mech customization, you have weapons for both your left arm, your left shoulder, your right shoulder. You have legs, you have torso, you have head, you have arms. Then you also have a fire control system, you have boosters, and you have a power generator. And you also have an additional module that you can unlock depending on what OCS upgrades you have. Now, the big thing about this game is that it's not necessarily about simply fighting things with bigger numbers. If you go through the game, you'll almost never see two items where one item's stat card is entirely blue or white and the other item's isn't. Blue or white indicating that it's at least as good or better. Most of the time there's going to be at least some red, even if the red isn't in areas you really care about, like, things like weight or energy consumption or whatever. So it's less about trying to find the perfect mech and more about trying to build a mech within a confined set of parameters. More powerful guns will be heavier, they'll consume more energy and weight, they're also going to have a lot more expensive ammo. Lighter legs have greater mobility, but this mobility comes at the cost of load bearing and energy, so you might not be able to carry as big guns. Ultimately, everything has trade-offs. Even if you look at the individual weapon behaviors, for example, the vertical launch missiles, while they fire really high up in the air and then drop down on opponents, which can be really handy, they're also completely useless on any map that has a very low ceiling. And this system of trade-offs leads to a scenario where no mech is going to be always better than another mech in every possible situation. There's always strengths and weaknesses to every build. And this also leads to a lot of combining and recombining of parts, just endlessly trying to find that exact right sweet spot for all of the stats to suit your personal playstyle, but also that is appropriate for whatever missions you're currently going on. And this is where Armored Core really excels, because customization on the whole is very well thought out and very well implemented. On top of the very robust functional customization, you also have very robust cosmetic customization where you can make the mech look basically however you want. You have all kinds of colors, you have all kinds of patterns, you have presets that you can use, or you can just make your own. You also have pre-built decals in the game, and then you can also go to the decal editor and create brand new decals. You can even import the decals. Overall, you just have a ton of options to make your mech look exactly how you want, in addition to making it play how you want. And once you're done, if you're happy with a certain build, you think it looks cool, and it's something you think you're going to use, you can actually save the data and you can go back and forth between several different mech builds, depending on the situation in which you find yourself. So overall, the customization system is just incredibly effective, and the game definitely wants you to use it. Like, the game presents challenges in front of you, a lot of whom require you to build different mechs or require you to at least consider using different loadouts on your current mech. Now we kind of have to talk about one of the more tedious parts of the mech customization in general and the game specifically, because you're going to spend a lot of your time in menus, and to kind of characterize why, There is no built-in penalty for buying and selling parts. So if I spend 200,000 credits to buy a part and I decide I don't like it, I can sell it back for that same 200,000 credits. But then if I decide later I actually do really like it or I need it for something, I can buy it back for that same 200,000 credits. There's no built-in penalty for buying and selling. It doesn't punish you for trying new things, and it incentivizes you to actually do so. However, the buy menu, the sell menu, and the assembly menu are all completely different from one another. So to use a simple example of exactly how annoying this gets, let's say you want to swap your right shoulder missile launcher for another missile, but you don't quite have enough money to buy that other missile launcher without selling your current one. So what you do is you go to the assembly shop, you unequip your current missile, you go to the sell menu, you sell it, you go to the buy menu, you buy the new one, and then you go back to your mech and you equip that new one. This is kind of tedious, a lot more so than it needs to be, especially because they could just integrate the buy and sell menu into the main AC assembly menu and it would basically change nothing. Like I said, there's no penalty for buying and selling. It's not like the game's trying to make you think about this, it wants you to do all of this customization. But it also kind of gets really tedious when you start getting later into the game and you're not just swapping out one part, but you're looking at whole new builds. Like when you have the money and the parts to start building multiple mechs and have them for different situations, now the simple one-to-one item comparison you get in a shop, when, you know, if I want to look at a right-hand weapon, I can only compare it to my current right-hand weapon. At this point, if I have like 3 or 4 parts I'm swapping, I have basically no idea of knowing if this is going to work until after I've already slapped it together and the game tells me that I'm overload or overpower or don't have enough power. So overall, the system is just really tedious and really annoying, and it gets even more so like as you progress through the game. Now, in Josh Drive Hayes' original review of Armored Core 1, he noted that it was really annoying that you had to keep flashing through these menus, and after playing Armored Core 6, I very much sympathize with that because they have kept it exactly the same. It is still just as tedious, and it's still just as redundant because in Armored Core 1 there was no penalty for buying and selling either. There was no reason for you to not just be able to buy and sell from the assembly menu in that game either. So, at least they're internally consistent, I guess. Now, as a secondary upgrade system, you do have what's called OS tuning. OS tuning is upgraded by getting OS chips, and you get OS chips by going in the arena and fighting essentially builds of other NPC mechs in the game. This is a pretty cool system because it's a very low risk system in which you get an upgrade material and you also get some cash, and you also get to see all of the cool different mech builds you could potentially run. So it could give you some ideas, or at the very least see the kind of stuff you can unlock later in the game. Additionally, you also have the training system, which I would highly recommend completing because at a bare minimum, even if you don't need the information, it still gives you parts. The parts, even if they're not useful, selling the parts is, so it still gives you cash. But if you're a newer player, it might give you some ideas of systems that you maybe hadn't thought about or hadn't realized. Now, one other thing you can do is you can replay older missions to try and build up some cash to help you buy more mech parts, and this is one of the distinguishing features between Armored Core 6 and, say, Armored Core 1. In Armored Core 1, you going into debt was definitely a thing, and you would get in this death spiral where you can't complete missions because you don't have enough money, but the fact that you don't have enough money means you can't get better parts to complete harder missions, and you just get in this like horrible state where you're doomed to fail. Now, in Armored Core 6, the designers apparently didn't think that was the core engagement they were looking for, so in Armored Core 6, cash is a lot more readily available, and training missions is just one of the ways you can get to it. And the missions themselves tend to be less punishing in terms of the amount of ammo and repair charges you get versus the rewards you get. So overall, the system is pretty generous when it comes to giving you resources because it wants you to be customizing and building your mechs to suit the different challenges. From this point on, you go into a mission structure. You get orders from the various voices in your head telling you to go out and kill people for money. Obviously, these voices in your head are just characters on a comm channel. Well, okay, except for the one that's actually a voice in your head and also appears after you get caught in the kind of large explosion that could result in head trauma. That's probably just a coincidence, best not to dwell on it. Anyway, the voices are offering you money to kill each other and seems terrifically unbothered by the fact that you were just hired to kill them last mission. The disembodied voice doesn't necessarily offer you money because she's a disembodied voice, but she does make a good argument for why you should go out and murder people unprompted, which should really be setting off way more alarm bells for the rest of your employers than it does. My favorite exchanges are when the other NPCs acknowledge that the mentally unstable mercenary piloting the Warcrime 9000 is hearing voices but decide to just burn that bridge when they get to it. It'll probably be fine. Incidentally, the voice acting, writing, and direction are all fantastic. The entire cast are bringing their A games, and the monologue and dialogues just drip with so much characterization and personality that it's just fun to listen to some of the characters banter back and forth. The entire first chapter is basically your tutorial. You go on missions to scan and interact with objects, you have vertical movement and platforming section in the Strider battle, and the game does send you on to more elaborate missions, but often with accompanying NPCs. Then you get to the entrance exam for Armored Core. You get to the mission that is really a test to see if you're ready for the rest of the game, and if the rest of the game is the experience that you're going to enjoy, and this is the Watch Point mission. The Watch Point mission opens up with a bunch of scattered enemy on elevated terrain and also turrets overwatching them, and in this stage you're required to use your mobility instead of just attacking head on. Then you have your first one-on-one fight versus the pilot of a rival AC, Sulla. Sulla is fairly mobile, he's aggressive, he's hard to hit at longer ranges as he'll almost always dodge a telegraphed attack. Then you get to Balteus, the boss. Balteus has a pulse shield that you have to break. He's more mobile than the other bosses you fought at this point, he has a more complex attack pattern, and he even adds moves when he gets below half health. Balteus is your chance to get off this ride if you don't think it's for you. This is probably going to be the quit moment for a lot of players that haven't fully internalized some of the more interesting and useful features of Armored Core up to this point. One of the features that the game expects you to be taking advantage of and that you should be taking advantage of, especially going forward, is that on the death screen, while you do have the standard buttons you'd expect, such as restart mission, restarts from checkpoint, quick mission, you also have the AC assembly button. You can just go back to the shop, swap weapons, or even change out to an entirely different mech. You can just load a different mech from AC data if you want. And then you'll respawn at full health and full ammo, ready to fight wherever you last started. From Software doesn't want you to give up and lose. They want you to win, but they also want it to feel satisfying to do so. Armored Core 6 doesn't punish you for trying and failing missions or boss fights, doesn't punish you for endlessly changing your mechs, and even lets you replay old missions if you're low on credits. Armored Core 6, like all From Software games, wants you to persevere and win and gives you the tools to do so. And so a lot of players don't like these tools because they feel like they might be cheesy, and this is like the ability to call for help in the Dark Souls games and fight with, a companion. But at the end of the day, these systems are there if you're having trouble, right? Like, these systems aren't just put in the game idly, they're put in the game specifically for a reason. And players should be taking advantage of them if they are having trouble. Now, if you don't want to use them as some kind of challenge run, that's perfectly fine. But a lot of players just don't use these systems reflexively because they feel like it's some sort of cheating. So you remember when I said I didn't really like the gunship battle in the tutorial? The simple reason is that's a pure execution boss. Your build is always the same, it doesn't matter. This, in my opinion, puts some players in the wrong mindset where they will, after that battle, treat the game like Dark Souls and every encounter as though it's only a matter of getting good. But Armored Core really wants and encourages build variety. If the developer had simply scattered some parts on the mechs you're poking throughout the intro, like another shoulder missile launcher, and if the player died to the gunship, they got a prompt to try equipping that gear they found, this might help. In my opinion, this would put a lot of players in a better mindset to meet the encounters they're going to run into throughout the game, because it's introducing a system the game wants you to be using if you're having trouble. I honestly think this might be the biggest reason why people have struggled with Balteus so much, and why so many players have quit, like, up to that fight, because Balteus is vulnerable to long-range powerful attacks. It doesn't specifically have a dodge, even though it has pretty decent mobility. Sulla, on the other hand, is almost immune to these types of long-range powerful attacks. And I don't think it's a coincidence these two characters are basically put back to back on what's effectively the entrance exam for the entire game. I think it's intended that if players are not, I won't say good enough, but if they don't have the mechanical execution to the point where they can fight these two back to back, the game builds in a window where you can simply switch builds to one is more appropriate after you get through with the fight with Sulla. And I really think players should be looking at considering this more than most of them are. After you get done with Chapter 1, the gloves are effectively off. The bricks are coming at your face, but your face probably resembles the side of a house for how many bricks have been thrown at it. If you can get through Sulla and Balteus without a guide, you can probably get through the rest of the game. The overall mission structure for the rest of the game has a good bit of variety. There are exactly 2 stealth missions, and both of them are weirdly out of place because you're basically walking around in an armed office building, and the detection of enemies in these missions is very inconsistent because the system for the game isn't really built for stealth gameplay. You can see this example where I fired a salvo of missiles at the enemy and they all just stand around staring at me. You can also see I'm just doing nothing because I thought I was detected and realized that somehow I wasn't, so I fired another salvo, and they failed to solve the mystery of the first volley of missiles, and they didn't solve the second one either. It's also important to note that if you do have a good scanner and you have vertical launch missiles, you can see enemies on the other side of buildings and fire missiles up in the air over the buildings and kill them, which is arguably the least stealthy way to engage in a stealth kill. Truly a shadow in the night I am as I fire giant flares up into the air for everybody to see as they crash down and explode on somebody. Always remember, if they only saw your missiles, they didn't technically see you, so you didn't get spotted. There's also some half-hearted attempts at platforming in the game, but it's important to note that Armored Core 6 is not really a game with fine platforming controls. A lot of your movement is made intentionally jerky and fast to increase the likelihood that you can get out of the way of incoming attacks, and that doesn't really combine well with trying to do precision platforming. Dark Souls and a lot of other Armored Core games already had this issue, and I don't know why From Software insists on putting these parts in the game. Typically, the only reason that the game gives as to why you can't fly is because some sort of giant laser will smash you. They actually do this a few times, including the Strider battle. What I found hilarious about the Strider battle is, despite the fact that you start on the ground and climb up to the Strider, if you fall off at any time, you'll take damage and it will put you back on the Strider. And if you're low enough on health, it'll kill you. Except at the very end of the Strider battle, you have to fly off the top of it anyway. The game just doesn't seem to ever know if falling is a problem or not, and it's just hilariously inconsistent. The boss fights overall do have some nice variety. Some are more gimmick oriented and some are just straight up brawls with other armored cores or other very mobile bosses. Now, as you near the end of the game, some of the unfairness does ramp up. The thing is, some of the in-game bosses start to have attack sequences that, if you get caught in them, you will just be stuck in this endless chain of damage as they basically juggle you until you die. This means that healing in a lot of the later boss fights feels kind of irrelevant, because if the first hit lands, it'll just stagger you into a chain of damage that will kill you from full health, no matter what you were previously sitting at. But it is at least nice that you can heal basically instantly and you don't have to sit there and drink an Estus flask. But this does mean that a lot of the boss fights feel more like you're operating on a very narrow margin of error, and if you slip up even a little, you'll just get annihilated. The only real saving grace of those kind of elaborate attack chains is that you will get back to the death screen to try again incredibly fast. There's also one boss that's kind of a gimmick boss and specifically requires you to carry an incredibly power and weight intensive weapon, so you kind of need a heavy build for it. So if you've been building incredibly light up to that point, you might have an issue, but it is what it is. Overall, I do like the boss variety. The behavior patterns are always pretty different. The overall feel of the boss arenas are pretty different. Some of them are a lot more compact, some of them are a lot more open. Some of them you have to do specific things, some of them you're just trying to punch them. Overall, I think you could do a lot worse in terms of boss variety. Now, as far as the plot of Armored Core 6, it's very reminiscent of an anime in that you start off with a pretty understandable premise, in this case, mercenary down on their luck going to another planet to try and buy your life back. At the end of the story, it's asking if it's morally correct to commit genocide to save the universe. I'm not really sure how we got here. Look game, my character is a mentally unstable person whose only redeeming feature is that they're good at piloting the Warcrime 9000 without asking too many questions about who they're killing or why. I feel like literally anybody else in the plot is better qualified to answer this question than my character. Now, calling back to earlier in the video, around halfway point, I was really struggling to figure out why my character was even still involved in the plot. I mean, it seemed like the game was kind of banking on me seeing the government authorities as assholes, as they were kind of the villain of the entire second act, but I was pretty ambivalent towards them. I mean, they tried to kill me, but so did everyone else who's currently giving me jobs. Well, except for the disembodied voice. Okay, they might actually try to kill you later, depending on what you do, but anyway. The only notable feature of the government forces was they seem very iffy about hiring a brain-damaged psychopath and a giant war machine that heard voices, and as that brain-damaged psychopath, I find that to be an entirely reasonable position. On top of that, it's not like the various factions trying to exploit or destroy Rubicon go home after the government forces are dealt with. If anything, removing them sets up the whole to genocide or not genocide plot point, so it's debatable if you shouldn't be helping get rid of your various mission providers. It just seems like your character has basically no reason to be hanging around other than they just have nothing better to do at that time. Also, I do briefly have to mention this going off of the whole like government forces thing. There's a mission where you kill a bunch of government forces and you take down a government warship, and then a bunch of other government warships shows up, and I'm like, oh my god, this is gonna be a really rough fight. And then it just fades to black with my dumbass in full view of an entire fleet. Like, what is this? Is this like a Saturday morning cartoon? You can't just fade to black and be like, everything is possible if we do it off screen? Are the enemies paying by the laser? Is their union mandated coffee break kicked in? Like, this moment annoyed me so much more than it should have because it made no sense to fade to black here with your character just staring at them like a lemming. The narrative has several decision points, but I kind of use the term decision points here pretty loosely. It gives you the option to choose between one of two missions, but the language is often pretty vague onto who it does or doesn't support. I also initially thought the term meant the decision would be end the mission, but it turns out no, selecting it is the decision point, which is not made terrifically clear until after you've already done it. The systems also feel kind of pointless given how many NPCs die at the end, and it mostly just determines which ones you personally get to kill, so it's more of a vendetta buffet than anything like narratively interesting most of the time. It's probably for the best as you can't save progress and the only way to replay the campaign is delete your current game and start fresh, but it still feels like a pretty insubstantial system. So ultimately, should you play Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon? From Software games are paradoxically the easiest and hardest to recommend. The systems and encounters within the games are meticulously well designed, but the gameplay experience in general is something that not every player will like or be accustomed to. The stability of the game was fantastic, I didn't have any bugs or crashes, the mech design is beautifully robust both in terms of cosmetic and functional aspects, and the system of trade-offs will lead to you fiddling a lot with builds endlessly. Every encounter is crafted to be an experience for the player, a challenge to be met, or a problem to be solved. The world itself is fully realized, from the environment itself to the voice acting, and it does all of this without bludgeoning you over the head with exposition. But the use of failure as an anticipated learning tool is not an experience for everyone, and while the individual characters are interesting, the overarching plot is utterly forgettable, right up until a handful of moments at the end, which means the game is basically hoping you like the moment-to-moment gameplay enough to overlook the thin veneer of plot it's riding on. I personally found it to be a great experience, and if you've liked what you've seen in this video, definitely check it out. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.